So while we're just waiting, I'll just welcome everyone that is here already, and let you know that we're going to have our wonderful panelists share their information in just a few minutes. Just wait until it's officially 6:30 to get started. But for anybody that's listening, it would be best if you have any questions to do it through the Q&A tab. That makes it easier to just try and make sure that we can get the questions and get answers for you. There's also the chat if you're wanting to just chat with people, but for actual questions and answers, it's best if we do try to go through the Q&A tab, and that just means we can keep an eye on that a little bit more. Everybody's getting a little better with Zoom, but we still have a few kinks sometimes to work out, I think. Still not quite second nature. Okay, so it's officially 6:30, and I guess we'll just get started. I'd like to say welcome to everyone and thank you for participating in our Legal 101 series. I would like to start by acknowledging that we are gathering on the traditional and unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan people, and we feel very fortunate to be able to be here in this community. I think over the last few weeks and months, we've certainly had an opportunity to maybe explore a little bit more, except for some people who had to keep going back to the office. But also, you know, it's been a difficult time, but I know that certainly over the last few weeks, being able to appreciate what a beautiful area we live in and how many incredible resources we have at our fingertips, it certainly made life a little bit easier for us being here. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that we are visitors here on this land, and so we'll leave it at that. We're going to just start our session in a few minutes. We have incredible speakers, Johnathan Arkle from Doak, Shirreff, and Sinead Scanlon and Aidan Northcott from Video Canada. Going to be sharing everyone's favorite topic, taxes. And charity law, but we've had such a great response to this session because I think it's something that everybody feels they really do need to be engaged in and learn more about for the organization that they're involved in. So it's a little bit different for us tonight, being able to not see all of the faces, and we're used to in these sessions having a fairly casual sort of response and interchange with people who are in the room. It's a little bit different because this platform is through the webinar, and so we can't have as much dialogue, but do feel please that you want to be able to ask your questions and share your thoughts. So again, I'll just review that it's better if you can go through the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen and submit a question there, and then we'll try and make sure that the panelists are able to get those questions and be able to answer them for you. And of course, feel free to chat and visit with yourselves with everybody through the chat button if that works for you. I would like to acknowledge that the Law Foundation of BC is the one who has been funding this series for us. And I was sharing with the panelists earlier today that when we put the original grant in for this session, we were anticipating about 80 people attending the workshops. And we've had such a phenomenal response. And I really thank everyone for committing their time and being here and committing your time not only in volunteering for organizations and being a part of organizations, but also in deepening your knowledge for it, because we're going to actually triple our goal, and we'll have had over 240 participants taking part in these workshops over the course of the 9 of them. So I think we can count it a big success. So now I'm going to turn it over to Johnathan Arkle. He's going to share with us first. And Johnathan, some of you may know because he's already presented for us for volunteers in the law. And in 2 weeks, he's actually going to be sharing some advice or some information uh, for startups and nonprofits. Thank you very much, Johnathan. Johnathan has grown up in the Okanagan and has been deeply steeped in business and also in nonprofits in that time, and likes to give back to the community, and we appreciate him being here. Thank you very much, Johnathan.
Thank you. Okay, maybe I'll just get my panelists so I can actually see their reactions. Everyone can see the slides okay? The screen sharing is coming through? Fantastic. Okay, so hi everybody. Many of you who were at the previous presentations might recognize me. My name is Johnathan Arkle. I'm a lawyer with Doak, Shirreff lawyers here in Kelowna, just down the street from KCR, in fact. And to begin the presentation, because I am a lawyer, a disclaimer. So obviously, please keep in mind that this presentation is being given in general terms. It's for free informational purposes only. It does not constitute specific legal advice to your situation, because especially in this context, I don't know your personal situation. So this is general commentary. Obviously, I do believe it's accurate. However, it might not be accurate to your situation. So please keep that in mind. And most importantly, my bosses would like me to remind you that just because I'm speaking to you right now, this isn't creating a legal retainer between Doak, Shirreff lawyers and you or your organization. Any views or opinions expressed are my own. All right, with that said, so obviously the presentation today is based on Charities Status and Income Tax Act. I'm incredibly fortunate that I am in fact a lawyer and not an accountant, because the Income Tax Act itself is terrifying, and I will leave the professionals to really speak to that, but I will speak to the legal aspect of registering a charity generally. And of course, this first thing that we're sort of discussing, less than even a legal question, more of a practical question, is why register as a charity? And it's important to, before we even dive into the why, is being aware of there are alternatives. It's not necessary to register your not-for-profit as a charity, or your society as a charity. And I put these three things up just as a beginning point to make sure that people aren't launching themselves into something that has a lot of responsibilities and a lot of sometimes onerous compliance requirements. When it is important to remember that there are alternatives to seek the goals that you're looking for. And those obviously include making a donation to existing charities. There's many, many out there with some incredibly important purposes, and it's important to continue to support them and donate through those existing avenues. There's also the opportunity of having donor-advised funds, or simply partnering with existing charities to perform whatever tasks or programs it is that you're trying to achieve. But moving right along, let's say that you are looking to incorporate. So number one of the big reasons for why people incorporate, and we chatted about this during our Volunteers in the Law presentation, is when a society or a corporation is incorporated, it creates what we call a corporate veil, is sort of the term that we use. And it can protect the people who are actually pulling the strings from liability. And that's one of the main reasons why people incorporate. Now, when you choose to incorporate a society, or whatever avenue is going to be the avenue for this charity, it's important to keep in mind, sort of the step one, is what jurisdiction is this corporation being incorporated under? When you incorporate, you are creating a legal person. Society run by directors is a legal entity in and of itself. I like to use the analogy of it's sort of from the Wizard of Oz. You've got Oz the Great and Powerful, this big floating fiery head, but then behind the curtain, there's someone sort of pulling those strings. And that's how corporation societies work in the eyes of the law. Is you might have Oz the Great and Powerful, which is the sort of charity itself, but there are people behind the curtain pulling the strings. And for the most part, the people behind the curtains are somewhat protected from liability for what happens, from the greater entity, with some very important exceptions. And there's also very important responsibilities that flow to the people who are behind the curtain, so to speak. The responsibilities and the like differ depending on jurisdictions based on the statute that applies to it. It's important to be aware, and obviously it's too much for me to go into in this presentation right here, but from a general standpoint, be aware of what jurisdiction it is that you're incorporating under. Alberta differs from BC, which differs from Saskatchewan in many ways. And then there's also the opportunity to incorporate sort of under a federal regime. And if you'd like further advice with respect to that, speak with a lawyer. I just have a note here that if you are incorporating in the federal acts, the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, it does not automatically mean that not-for-profit corporation is exempt from tax under the Income Tax Act, but speak with a tax professional with respect to that. And I guess this last part here, it is important to be aware of the CRA's requirements prior to preparing your incorporation documents. So if you are starting up a business or a corporation that you're hoping can be registered as a charity or a society, if I use the term corporation and society, I'll be using them sort of interchangeably here. But when you are creating that entity, it's important to be aware of what the CRA's requirements are going to be prior to even creating those incorporation documents, because the CRA's requirements with respect to what is required for charities with a capital C is very particular, and it's basically the gist of this entire presentation. Okay, so what that important thing is what the purposes of the charity are. The CRA has certain requirements that must be met for a charity to remain registered as a charity in Canada. And number one, this is perhaps sort of the biggest and maybe most obvious things, is that it must be exclusively charitable. Now, at this link here, I understand these slides will be circulated to everyone after the fact, so you don't need to try to rapidly write that URL down. But it includes the CRA's examples of model purposes, so it gives you a bit of an idea of what are acceptable as charitable purposes. But the basic takeaway is that it must be exclusively charitable, which means no private benefit. There's not a sort of benefit for the people, the directors of the charity or its employees, so to speak, outside of operating costs. Purposes is a very distinct term, and it's different from activities. Now, those two terms that are in quotes right there are very important to keep in mind, and I'll get into a little bit more detail further in the coming slides. But when you're thinking about what the actual purpose of the charity is versus the activities that it's carrying out, again, very specific requirements under the CRA. Do not apply with respect to, if you're going to be listing in your application for what the activities of this society or this potential charity will be. Don't include what the pre-incorporation activities might have been. This is a forward-looking application. So you want to include detailed descriptions of each stated purpose and activities of the charity. Again, a URL here because this presentation is being given in as sort of 10,000 foot view perspective as it can be. The horse's mouth, obviously, is what we'll always go back to, and that's what I would encourage you to explore in these links to see what the revenue agency itself has provided. But when we're talking about sort of what the purposes of, from a legal standpoint, purposes of the charity must be, the way that judges and the legal approach to this is we apply what we call, it's constantly called the PEMSL test, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But basically, when looking at whether or not the purposes of a charity are indeed charitable purposes, we look back to four main categories. Again, we call that the PEMSL test. It's looking it kind of stems way back from I think it's the Statute of Elizabeth. There was some wording in an old statute that kind of began to guide us in this direction. And to be perfectly honest, the definition of what are charitable activities hasn't changed in the law. It's one of those real sticking points where it doesn't expand, and there's reason why. But the leading case we still look back to nowadays was the Supreme Court of Canada case, which reaffirmed that there are four traditional common law categories which are acceptable purposes of a charity, which are the relief of poverty, the advancement of education, the advancement of religion, or other purposes beneficial to the community. Those four main categories have not changed in years and years. Just looking at my notes here, sorry. And and I'll go into a little bit of detail about what this case was. So the reason we got the Supreme Court of Canada giving any kind of opinion on a charity or not is to give you a basic sort of legal 101 of how our legal system works in Canada. Is when administrative bodies, including the CRA, makes decisions, sometimes those decisions can be challenged in court. In this case, it would be the Federal Court of Appeal. And if you have the money to further appeal a decision, it can go all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada. When decisions are made in the Supreme Court of Canada, they have a binding effect across all of Canada, all provincial jurisdictions. So this case was, obviously a little close to home, being Vancouver, a Vancouver society, but it does have a binding effect over all of Canada, and we look to it still as precedent. What the basics, sort of facts, the story of this case was that it was a society applying for registration as a charitable organization. And what the primary purpose of the Vancouver Society of Immigrant and Visible Minority Women was they wanted to provide educational forums, classes, workshops, seminars to immigrants and visible minority women with the hope of empowering them to, or enabling them to find employment. And what it came down to was this question. Basically, in short, the Revenue Canada rejected the society's application for charitable status, and basically on the grounds that it wasn't convinced that the organization was exclusively for charitable purposes, which is required for registration. So it came to the court to basically decide whether or not the society's purposes were indeed exclusively charitable. It's all well and good to say we're out for education and or we're out for the advancements of education or the relief of poverty, but you need to know whether or not the purpose is exclusively those charitable purposes. And the court also, took this opportunity, all things considered, 1999, when we look at the legal system, that's not that old of a case. So the court took this opportunity to see whether or not the definition of charitable purposes should be revised or expanded. And in the end, the court actually dismissed the appeal in the end, and basically found that the activities of the society, obviously I don't have time now to go into all the details of the facts, but the court did find in the end that the activities weren't exclusively charitable when looking at it in the wide lens. So, all things considered, they were doing good out there for sure, but it wasn't exclusively charitable. And here's a little excerpt from a different case, which kind of speaks to, you think, well, it seemed like they were doing good in the community. Why wouldn't that be charitable? And this is a quote, again, from the Supreme Court of Canada, but in 2007, where they say, quote, "If every organization that might be found to have beneficial byproducts, regardless of its purposes, were found to be charitable, then the definition of charity would be much broader than what was heretofore been recognized by the common law." And that's basically the court, again, saying that we have this history in the common law of recognizing what's charitable and what isn't. Basically, it's been working for a long time. And there's many, many organizations that are able to operate within that regime, within those boundaries. And this is the court saying that if we let everybody or if we deemed everybody who had beneficial byproducts to be a charitable purpose, well, then of course it would be broader, but we don't. It needs to be exclusively charitable within those realms of these four main qualities. Now, it's important to make this distinction that it's not always clear. There's lots of commentary out there that the lack of the change in the meaning of charity for centuries, really, it's been subject to criticism. Of course it has. So as has sort of the fact that CRA has almost exclusive control over what qualifies as a charity or not, because I'll touch on this in another slide, but of course CRA isn't, its focus is somewhere else. Its focus is on tax. Its focus isn't necessarily on regulating charities. So the fact that we sort of have this tax system run by the CRA that in a way seems to be the only controlling body over what whether something is a charitable purpose or not. Of course, it's subject to criticism, but it's important at this point to just note that the distinctions aren't always clear. So the example I give here is for poverty, for example. It's been found that preventing poverty, which is different from relieving poverty, preventing poverty does not qualify. In that case right there, or that instance right there from 2016 is a example of that exact example, preventing poverty not qualifying as a charitable purpose. However, sort of another similar example, but on the other side, in this case, St. Catherine Senior Apartments, there was low income seniors housing, which was held to be, quote, for the relief of the poor, for municipal property tax. And in this case, it was found to be relief of property, even though it was basically, well, you can sort of see from the example there was discussion over where do we put this standard of what it means for poor? Where does the line exist for poverty, the relief of poverty, right? So it's contextual. Every situation is going to be different obviously. But another example in context of education is there was a case here where it was a Hosteling International Canada was trying to be deemed as a charity, and they said, how are we providing education? Well, we're facilitating travel by providing low-cost accommodation, which provides people an opportunity to have accommodation and pursue education, which might not have been available for them previously. But this was found not to be the advancement of education. So again, some great goals and no doubt beneficial byproducts of these proposed charities, but the CRA found, and the courts assessing the ideas or the proposals, finding that they are not, in fact, charitable purposes. Okay, so with all of that ambiguity sort of touched on, to be clear that it's not a straight cut and dry application, let's talk about the application. So number one, and there might be some more discussion on this a little bit later, but I'll breeze through it really quickly. This is what the application for applying as a charity looks like. So number one, you're going to need to be able to identify what the organization is. So that includes business number or the society's registration number with respective body that it's been, or jurisdiction that it's been registered with, mailing address, information on any prior applications that may have gone through, and that includes if this was an application to re-register. You're going to need to know what the organizational structure of this society or corporation, potential charity is going to be, which includes having, as applicable, these types of documents to provide to the CRA. Back to sort of the main gist of what I'm talking about is what are the activities of the organization going to be? And again, that's different from the purposes. The purposes are different from the actual day-to-day activities of charity. So you're going to want to include detailed description of what the stated purpose of the charity is, and then also details about its activities. And here's some details in case this is a charity that is performing activities outside of Canada. There's some guidance from the CRA. If you do a Google search for that term that's within the quotes, it'll give you a bit of an idea if you are representing a potential charity or charity that conducts activities outside of Canada. Okay. This is further to the activities. You're going to want to have the details about how you're going to be fundraising. Fundraising in itself cannot be the purpose of a charity. That's one thing that has been confirmed by the courts. This was in the case, again, looking at a more recent one, Opportunities for Disabled Foundation, where the court reaffirmed that the purpose of this charity, which was to employ disabled persons as fundraisers, was not in itself a charitable purpose. Again, so obviously very intertwined with charitable purposes, absolutely, providing benefit to greater society. However, the court said, and you can see that quote right there, fundraising itself cannot be the reason for a charity, its purpose for being, essentially. You're going to want to also disclose full disclosure with respect to related businesses, any potential political activities. How political activities intertwined with charities is a whole discussion that I can't even begin to touch on in this presentation, but it's important to be alive to charities interacting in any way with political activities is something that you're going to want to be able to, you're going to want to speak to an advisor about prior to engaging in. And also any business holdings or real property, which means land, that's owned by the organization. Okay, so let's say you cover all of that, you've gotten your proper advice from your legal team, your accounting team, and you send in your application, but it has been, oh, sorry, I skipped through a slide, sorry, backing up application. You're also going to want to provide your budget and any foreign expenditures, again, if you're working overseas. Details of who the officials and directors of the organization are going to be. So who are going to be the people, the operating minds of the charity, the wizard behind the curtain, to use that analogy again. And then also who is authorized representation of that charity as applicable. All right, so let's say your application gets rejected. What does that look like? So first thing you can do is file a notice of objection. So that is an internal CRA appeal. Basically, that is, well, directly with Revenue Canada, appealing their decision to reject it. It's sort of cut and dry what it is. Now, if they stand their course and they don't change their mind, then it gets, then you can appeal to the Federal Court of Appeal, where now it's in front of a judge, it's in front of a federal judge. All of these decisions, aside from the Supreme Court of Canada ones, have been decisions where basically courts have been reaffirming or addressing the decisions made by the CRA. So the case law that I've been discussing earlier is the result of the second point here, where you can see an appeal. Obviously, these charities first sent in their notice of objection to the CRA, then tried their hand again with the Federal Court of Appeal, and then again, in some instances, have gone even further to the Supreme Court of Canada, which truly is the end of the road with respect to your attempts to appeal. Okay, so there we go. Audits, CRA audits. So this is, again, sort of, I got ahead of myself speaking on that previous slide, saying that, you know, it is subject to some criticism, the fact that the CRA has this sort of unilateral control over charitable status. There is no federal regulator of charities other than the CRA, and CRA's priorities are obviously taxes. They're a tax administrator. So it's all looked through this lens with respect to the money that's flowing through charities, rather than I'll just say, rather than a different non-tax related lens. So as a result, but regardless, audits are conducted by the CRA. They are the ones that basically have the control to decide whether or not you're meeting the requirements that we've discussed in the previous slides. Your purposes, your activities, are they keeping in line with the requirements under the Income Tax Act? Now, losing your charitable status. I'll touch on that very quickly. So obviously, this one might seem obvious, is that you can revoke your charitable status voluntarily. Here are some examples of situations where you might see that happening. It's not necessarily the result of a mandate from the CRA, but might be because of mergers or consolidations with other organizations or existing charities. It might be that you simply achieved the goal you were trying to achieve. You know, the example we use here is charity was established to build a playground, and it was built. Or you may no longer have the required financial or physical resources to run the charity. Obviously, charities and not-for-profits generally are operated on the goodwill of people with some spare time, and unfortunately, many a charity has had to shut their doors because they all live very busy lives. Voluntary revocation is discretionary per the CRA. It cannot be used to avoid ongoing non-compliance action, which is worth noting. So basically, if you are not complying with the requirements of the Income Tax Act, it's not a simple, we're revoking, we're shutting doors, and now you're off scot-free. So just worth noting, it's not a voluntary revocation, it's not a get out of jail free card, so to speak. Now here are some examples for where it's not so voluntary. So that can be revocation for failure to file necessary annual documents that are required for any corporate entity or society. This is probably the most common reason for charity status being revoked. And I have a note here just saying that if you do not file a complete return within 6 months of the end of your fiscal year, CRA then themselves start the revocation process. Obviously discussed audits earlier. That's how the CRA will basically address and investigate whether or not you're meeting the requirements. If the CRA audits the charity and finds that you do not comply with the requirements of registration, then they can revoke your charitable status. Examples of non-compliance can include not devoting your resources to that exclusively charitable purpose, not keeping adequate books or records, which are the responsibilities of the directors and officers of the charity, or simply not having sufficient direction and control over the resources. Where we often see challenges such as that are particularly charities that have overseas operations as well, where it's a little bit more difficult to have that on the ground control over what's happening with the money that's being donated. Is it actually going into that building project? Is it actually going into that community where it was intended to? So that's something that is a very common one, is the not having direction and control over the resources. And we have revocation for other reasons. My example there, technically speaking, that kind of falls more under the revocation for failure to file, but losing corporate status would be a reason for having charity status revoked. Now, how this applies to you personally as well as the people responsible for this charity, the people pulling the strings behind the curtain, depending on the reason of the charity's registration being revoked, its directors and officers can be found to be, and this is a defined term within the Income Tax Act, as ineligible individuals. And if you are deemed to be an ineligible individual, then you can be unable to run or register another charity. And importantly, on one hand, you might think that makes sense. If someone's deemed an ineligible individual, you don't want them running off and trying to start up other charities where you've already demonstrated that they couldn't keep that one going. But it's important to keep in mind that having ineligible individuals as directors can in itself be a reason for a charity's registration being revoked. So, for example, if you have a director in your organization who happens also to be director of many other charities around, and that director is then found to be an ineligible individual because of the conduct of that separate charity, it can have recurring effect, chain effects, I guess you'd say, on your organization. Moving right along. All right, if your charitable registration is revoked, then you cannot issue official donation receipts, perhaps common sense. You don't qualify for an exemption from Income Tax Act as a registered charity. You have your name and the reason for revocation published in the Canada Gazette and in the list of charities. You must transfer all of your remaining assets to an eligible donee or pay revocation tax. And you will not, and then obviously you will not be a charity for GST or HST purposes, which also then has that chain effect of affecting your tax status of your applies, way you calculate net tax, or your ability to claim rebate for GST or HST. And I'm sure people who are much more well-versed in that topic will speak to it. One thing I will note is that it is possible to use your remaining assets for your charitable activities or transfer them to an eligible donee during that wind-up period once your registration has been revoked. Okay, and that's the end of my side of the presentation. So it was a little doom and gloom because we're a lawyer and we're Pessimistic perfectionists is what I heard someone say once. So we're always focused on where and how things go wrong. But obviously wanted to highlight just how murky some of these definitions can be, and the importance of recognizing that it's not clear, which is why it's important to talk to someone who can really help hash it out with you, which includes obviously legal advisors and financial advisors, who I will now hand it off to.
Thank you, Johnathan. Before we actually switch to Sinead and Aidan, I thought it may be nice to just say thank you to you for sharing such great knowledge. But we did have a few questions come up on the Q&A. So I just wanted to ask you those questions, Johnathan, and see if you would be able to answer, or any of our panelists would be able to answer. Would there be a large legal fees if one applies and gets rejected and then goes to court?
Ooh, unfortunately, I can anticipate the answer there would be yes. The reason being, just because legal fees are, large legal fees is a tough nut to crack just in and of itself. Lawyers, whether it's here at my firm or any other firm across Canada, basically the way our legal system is structured is lawyers' fees are based off of an hourly rate. Different lawyers have different hourly rates. Typically, it's based on their years of experience or specialized experience. And legal fees aren't typically fixed price. Instead, it's if a lawyer spends 1 hour on something, well, it's going to cost a certain amount, usually their hourly rate. If they spend 2 hours, it's going to be double that. If they spend 8 hours, it's going to be even more. So when you're dealing with something such as court applications, which are incredibly time consuming and oftentimes lengthy, requiring quite a bit of preparation, generally speaking, when you see the C word, court, you can anticipate large legal fees, yes. But yeah, unfortunately, it's not a cut and dry fee that, oh, appeals are this amount. So I'm afraid it's not a really satisfying answer, but yes, if you were going to court to appeal, it is likely that there would be legal costs incurred, yes.
I think this is one of those instances of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure kind of thing too, right? When charities are first starting up when nonprofits are looking to move into that charity status, that they get some good advice sort of before they go to that leap, and people being here is part of this already, but I think that's where they can make sure that they get a little bit more advice before they go rather than trying to deal with it retroactively. Do you guys say that's fair?
Yep.
For both accountants and yeah, great.
Absolutely.
Does anybody know how long these appeals would typically take? And can you still act as a nonprofit if you're rejected from charitable status or waiting appeal? I believe you could still be a nonprofit because you are already, because they're two separate things, right?
Correct. Yes, that's the correct answer to that side of it. Yes, you can still operate as a nonprofit, even if you're rejected for charitable status. I see another question from Melanie at the bottom about, speak to the advantages of being a charity. And I think the next speakers will go into that quite a bit more. I think the short answer is tax advantages. But when it comes to the actual operations of your organization, your not-for-profit, well, of course, you can continue to practice and carry out those activities and run as you were. You just won't be subject to the tax implications that come with being a registered charity. Again, it comes down to that whole charities in Canada, it's a tax issue, it's a tax thing, and it's governed by the Income Tax Act and audited by the CRA. When it comes to the operations of societies themselves or not-for-profits, well, that's a separate matter. It just comes down to how the charitable status is going to affect the tax side of the picture. So yes, you can still operate as your not-for-profit. As for how long those appeals would typically take, the CRA, with their responses to notices of objection, are historically slow. They are a bureaucracy like any others. So basically, it depends on how long it moves through their system, and it's gonna differ case by case. I don't have a hard and fast answer for you for how long the appeals would typically take. particularly when you start looking at it for further appeals to federal court or further appeals to the Supreme Court of Canada. And how do you find out if someone on your board is an ineligible individual? Well, as we said before, obviously, if the status is revoked from one of these organizations, there were those reporting examples, and go back to one of the slides earlier with how those charities that have had their status revoked are reported, including in the Gazette. But finding out if someone on your board is an ineligible individual, unfortunately, there isn't a list, so to speak.
No, but sorry, I could speak to that. Just part of the New Society Act also states that when directors, they must sign a statement coming on before they become directors, and that is one of the things that they need to be signing off on, that they will stand as a director and that they are eligible to be a director. So they would have to disclose that to you, or before you're allowed to accept them as a director.
You're absolutely right. And that speaks again. Oh, sorry. No, I'll let you go, Eden.
Okay, I was just going to jump in there is sometimes the definitions under various societal acts or the Income Tax Act differ. They have similar meanings, but there can be very nuanced differences. We all will get into some of these other, the ineligible individual one in our upcoming presentation, and hopefully that will answer it in a little bit more detail. So yeah, it's not a real clear answer because what may be the case for one isn't the case for the other.
Precisely, yeah. I think an important general takeaway is to dovetail Aidan's comment there is statutes and legislation differ and differ in important ways between jurisdictions. And that includes federally to provincially, and statutes have very specifically defined terms that just because it's defined one way in one act doesn't necessarily mean it's applied in the same way in another act, which goes back to one of my earlier slides, I believe, which was when choosing to incorporate your not-for-profit, set up the society in the first instance, be aware of which jurisdiction it is that you are operating this under, because that has, to this point, effects on many other documents.
I think just a couple of the other questions, just so everybody is aware, and you may have joined us a little bit later, but we will be sharing the slide deck afterwards. I'll email it out to the participants so everybody can have them. And then we'll also make the recording available to people so that right now we're recording this session, and then we'll make that available for everybody so you can review some of it and also share with other directors on your board, because as Johnathan has said, and I'm sure Sinead and Aidan will say too, is there's a lot of nuances, a lot of detailed information, and I don't want anybody to sort of miss out on that. So you'll have the opportunity to listen to the recording again as well. Okay. Then what would be the essential co-organization structure and commitment level to support an application and to maintain status? I think that might be something that you guys will talk about, Sinead, because of whether or not you want to go for charity status or not. What's involved in that?
So that seems like a question that everyone's favorite answer is it depends. But I think that's a big question, and you know, if we haven't kind of addressed that by the end of myself and Aidan's presentation, then we'll maybe come back to it. But I think because you're really organizations or charities, NPOs that you're setting up, depending on the mandate, can be, you know, very large organizations, or it could really be done by maybe a couple of individuals that would just be your core people. So I think it depends on the scope of what you're actually, you know, planning to achieve. So yeah, maybe let's circle back to that at the end and see if we've covered that off for art, I believe.
Okay, that's great. So thank you very much, Johnathan, and you'll stick around still too for the Q&A at the end, I think, as well, right? So now I'd like to turn it over to Sinead Scanlon, who is a partner with BDO Canada at the Kelowna office here, Sinead is an amazing woman who I've had the pleasure of being on a board with, but is also a chair of the United Way currently. And so has given a lot of time to nonprofit organizations. And then also Aidan Northcott, who's a senior manager with BDO Kelowna. And they're going to be giving us a great presentation about charity stuff. And they really are the people who are in the know for the actual charity, the tax status part of it. So thank you both for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dorothy. Very kind words. Thank you for the invite, first of all. Myself and Aidan are really happy to be here and to speak to the group of attendees. A distinction that probably will mean nothing to anybody except Aidan and I is we're both auditors at heart. And some of the tax questions that come up, and indeed the presentation tonight that we're delivering, was helped along by our tax department at BDO. So we, neither of us are tax specialists in the area, but a lot of our working lives are, as Dorothy said, working with NPOs, and more specifically with registered charities throughout the Okanagan. So yeah, thanks for the invite. Aidan is an audit senior manager in our Vernon office. I'm lucky that Aidan and I get to work on a lot of projects together and have a lot of clients in common. And he's usually my first port of call if something comes up and I don't know the answer to. So let's kick this off with the first slide. We're going to split this up. I'm going to talk about NPOs, and then Aidan is going to talk about some registered charities. So if you want to go to the next slide, Aidan, I think, are you sharing? Perfect. So introductions, we're already done. The differences, so we're not going to do these kind of individually by slides. We're hoping that by the time we're finished the presentation that we've kind of covered a lot of the topics here. So the pros and cons, the differences between the two, what are the benefits of being an NPO versus a registered charity, what are the requirements of both, and what are the, I guess, reporting and requirements and expectations. And Johnathan has talked a lot tonight about kind of the fact that you need to really look at your organization, what you're hoping to achieve from it, and then structuring it in the right way. So getting advice from somebody like Johnathan right at the inception, I think, is really key. And I've helped a couple of clients at the very start of their charitable organizations, and it's the first thing that I'll say is who's your lawyer, and are they experts in this field? Because I think that's something that's really key. Lawyers are obviously great to deal with, but you certainly need to know that you're dealing with somebody who's been, through the ringer when it comes to something as specific as registered charities. So we'll go to the next slide, which really talks about what is a non-for-profit organization. So I'm not going to read out the slides. As Dorothy said, they're available afterwards. And some of these we do tend to fall back under the Income Tax Act and some definitions. But really, what is a non-for-profit organization? It's a club, a society, an association. We'll talk about some specific examples of what those are to help. I always like to try and use practical examples to help me understand it better. This is really an organization, an association that's not a charity, so kind of everything else except. So the idea behind setting up this non-for-profit is it's for a social welfare type of project, for general pleasure or recreation, and really for any other purpose other than to make a profit from it. So that's really a non-for-profit organization. And it has to be, or it will be, exempt from tax. So these numbers, section 149(1)(L), these are all references to the Income Tax Act. As Johnathan had mentioned a couple times in his presentation, the CRA really is kind of who we fall back to as the kind of governing body for where organizations fit in the structure, whether they're registered charities or whether they're non-for-profits. So the next slide talks about the registration requirements that we're talking about for NPOs. So NPOs will be set up when they're incorporated as often as Canadian corporations. So right now, there's no registration process with CRA, and CRA doesn't have a list of NPOs. So if you're a registered charity, and Aidan's going to talk about this, so if somebody comes to me as a registered charity and wants Aidan and I to perform an audit for them, one of the first things that we'll do is do a quick online search to CRA, and it will tell you if they are generally compliant with all of their filings, and really just tell you if they're in good standing. And that CRA database is pretty invaluable and is kind of a one-stop shop if you, as just a general member of the public, wanted to find out more about organizations. So say if somebody approached you and they wanted you to become a board member, or they wanted you to volunteer, and you were just really interested in learning more about them, that information is online. And we're going to talk about the filings that you have to do with CRA. And then CRA, what they'll do is then publish those online for you to take a look at. Maybe not the full information, because some of that would be confidential, like your boards of directors' home addresses need to be filled in for some of your tax filings. That obviously wouldn't be publicly available. So just back to the slide here. So there's no registration process for NPOs, but CRA does. And CRA does not have a list of those NPOs other than the NPOs that are required to file an information return. So we'll talk about what an information return is in a couple of minutes. An NPO must state its purpose. We'll skip back maybe just one more, Aidan, thanks so much. An NPO must state its purpose in its own incorporation documents, and Johnathan covered that already. You really need to explain what your mandate and your purpose is for setting up your NPO. And then there's concerns that have been raised that some organizations claiming the NPO tax exemption may be earning profits. So in the previous slide, what I referred to as the mandate really in setting up these NPOs, one of the overarching principles is that you can't be setting this up for the purpose of making a profit from it. And CRA and the audits that they will be looking at is really making sure that when you set this up with all of these kind of guiding principles in place, with not to make a profit, they're really going to throw the book, I would say, at organizations that are skirting those rules. And really from, revocation purposes that Johnathan touched on, that's really who they're going to be gearing those kind of penalties at. So we can go to the next slide. So commercial activity, that's what we're talking about, is making a profit. Now, CRA's opinion is that it's okay if it's incidental, but if you weren't able to conduct the operations of your NPO without these incidental or without these commercial activities, then they would deem you to be making a profit. Then you would no longer be able to have that status. So that's what they're really looking at, is making sure that you're not trying to, in the financial statements and the NPO returns that you would file, that they want to see that you're not really generating a profit that's not incidental to the organization. So some NPO examples. So Dorothy mentioned that her and I were sitting on a board together for many years, and this is a couple of years ago, and that was for a festival organization. So other examples are social, recreational, hobby groups. So yeah, golf clubs, curling clubs, bridge clubs, just, people that are coming together to form an organization, but really the profit isn't what you have at the forefront of why you're doing it. Amateur sports organizations, so any kind of hockey leagues, baseball leagues, soccer leagues. So those are some examples that you would most frequently be involved with. So tax filing requirements of an NPO. So one of the questions that came up now a couple times was, what are the benefits of an NPO versus a charity, or why would we want to do one or over the other? So I will say that under registered charity purposes, the reporting requirements with CRA are far more onerous. and for an NPO, they're less onerous for sure. There's a couple of options here. So an NPO is required to file an income tax return. So that's a T2. And that would be the most common that we see is through a corporation. I don't think I've ever seen that an inter-vivos trust. So I don't think I've ever seen that. I'm not sure, Aidan, if you have either, but they're almost always set up as a corporation. Of course, the minister can also demand that it file a return as well. I don't think that I've ever seen an example of that. And a corporation must file a T2 corporate tax return. So that's just part of the NPO requirements that you would have. If you're a corporation, you're filing a T2. If you're set up as a trust, you would file a T3. Now, I'm not going to go into any of the specifics here about the timing, because that is now all changed under COVID. But typically for a T2, it would be no later than 6 months after your year end, and for a T3, it's 90 days. So again, a little bit more cumbersome if it's set up as a trust.
Yeah, and the T2 would be on top of what's referred to as the T1044 NPO information return. So you'd actually have two filings.
Mm-hmm. And here we go, the next slide, T1044 NPO information return. So if you wanted to go to the next one, thanks, Aidan. So in addition to that T2, that T1044 is the information that may be required as well, if the following things happen. So if that passive income received in the year is greater than 10,000, your total assets, so I guess we're presuming here that a financial statement of some kind. Aidan and I are auditors, but that's certainly not mandatory. They can be internal financial statements for the purpose of putting together a T2 or an information return. Those can be done internally in the club. Maybe if you have a festival organization and you're lucky enough to have somebody who's financially minded, then being able to complete this information yourselves. But if total assets that you had exceeded $200,000 for the previous fiscal, or there was a requirement to file a 1044 in a previous year. This is a little bit of a funny one. I feel like some of our clients filled in about maybe 2016, 2017, CRA conducted a fairly significant review on non-for-profits in general and issued some kind of notices to some organizations, but not all, that they needed to file a 1044. Now, if you had to at one point, then now you always have to. But they weren't consistent in how they did that. So I would just speak to your advisor, your accountant, or your auditor on that. If you've had to do it before, then you probably it's easier to continue that process. And the 1044s, to be honest, are not overly cumbersome to complete. And that has to be filled out 6 months after year end. Again, now that we're in the COVID environment, all of those deadlines have been extended. And CRA has been a lot more generous with the filing requirements and easing of any kind of restrictions from a filing purpose. So I think the next slide, Aidan's going to take over and he's going to talk about what is a registered charity and some of the different filing requirements and some of the differences there for registered charities.
Yeah, thanks, Sinead. So a registered charity can be kind of broken down into three main categories. And so that's just a charitable organization itself, a private foundation, or a public foundation. The catch with that being that they are resident in Canada or were created or established in Canada. And so examples of this we could see is branches or sections or some sort of other division of an organization that's registered in Canada and was basically created or established in Canada to receive donations on its own behalf. So there might be an international organization that is actually also been created in Canada that is meant to collect donations on behalf of that larger organization. as we've already kind of well established, you have to apply to the minister in a prescribed form, and we kind of already went through all those details as to what needs to be provided. And as we said, a list of registered charities can be found on the CRA's website. And we haven't provided a link, but if you just go into Google and you just type in registered charities, CRA or Registered Charities Canada, it's going to be the first Google hit that you get. So yeah. Just a little bit of lag right here. There we go. So we were talking about qualified donees, or we were talking about ineligible individuals. But before we get there, we'll talk about qualified donees. And so when we talk about a charitable organization, so that's an organization, regardless of whether it's incorporated or not, under provincial statute. And the whole purpose of that organization is to devote all of its resources to charitable activities. As part of that as well, no part of the income can be payable or available to the personal benefit of any proprietor, member, shareholder, trustee. So this is that whole purpose of you can't receive any sort of benefit from establishing the charity. And so it's got to go towards that charitable purpose. And then as well, in order to be a qualified donee as a charitable organization, which changes a little bit when we get into foundations, you have to have more than 50% of the directors, trustees, officers, or any other kind of like officials must be arm's length. And when we talk about arm's length, that's again, it's one of those terms that kind of changes depending on which legal or tax definitions. They're similar, but again, there's kind of some nuances. But generally, that means you're not related to each other. So if we were to think about, just a couple directors of a charity and it's a husband and wife team, then they're offside because they're related through marriage, or father, son, or mother, anything kind of immediate family members. But if you were to have, kind of spread that out and you had half that are family and the other half are non-arm's length, so unrelated members, then you're back on side with that arm's length definition. And the other catch as well is you can't be controlled by a person who's contributed more than 50% of the capital. So that changes though when we get into foundations. So this would be quite common. We would see situations like CMHA, we could think of Salvation Army. All of those charitable organizations kind of fit that this definition here. So then when we start talking about charitable foundations, it can be kind of, again, it could be a corporation or trust. It's constituted and it's exclusively for charitable. Again, no part of the income can be made for the personal benefit of a particular member, shareholder, or trustee. And but the difference here is that you can have this breakdown between private and public. And so with private and public foundations, in general, it directs its charitable work while the foundation gives money to charitable organizations. So for anyone that's familiar with the community foundation, and the sun is kind of now into my eyes as it's swinging around through my office, community foundation, each local community has its own community foundation. And so their big purpose is to just gather money from individuals. They hold that money in trust through endowments, and then they use the returns on that money to disperse that out to other charities. So what constitutes charitable activities? So we've gone through this. So again, just kind of touch on it at a high level. So we talked about relief for poverty, the advancement of education, the advancement of religion, and other purposes beneficial to the community, which can be quite broad, but some kind of examples here include animal shelters, libraries, and volunteer fire departments, so that those have very clear, distinct benefits to society that have, in these cases, been deemed charitable. So when we talk about non-qualified donees, so if you're a charity, you can't gift to organizations that aren't qualified donees. And so if you're not, you can't give a gift as a charity onto another not-for-profit, for example. You can't provide any sort of personal benefits. So sometimes what falls afoul is where you have personal scholarships, so payments to individuals, and those are personal in the sense that they are going to. It's not an overarching category of scholarship. It can't go for private benevolence. Activities supporting political candidates, we've talked about that one. That one it can get very detailed. Business activities, so that again, that's been kind of covered off. And obviously activities that are deemed illegal. So you can't set up a charity to try and launder all your money that you've been making. So what are the advantages? So this was one of the questions, and so there's a few. The biggest one really is the ability to actually issue official donation receipts for you that receive as gifts, whether they're cash gifts or non-cash gifts. And the benefit of getting that is the person that's giving it that cash gift or non-cash gift gets a small tax benefit as a result of that. They get to claim a tax credit for the value of that, or a portion of the value of that. And so that's one of the unique differences between just a not-for-profit is you can still contribute to a not-for-profit, but you're not getting a bit of a tax benefit in return. You're also exempt from paying income tax. There's some differences as an NPO. You still don't have to pay income tax in certain situations. So there's some kind of similarities there. You are eligible to receive gifts from other registered charities. So we're talking about foundations. So if you're a registered charitable organization and you receive money from a foundation, that's all okay. The biggest one is probably the increased credibility in the community. And it's not to say that not-for-profits that aren't charities don't get that credibility, but predominantly in order to maintain your charity status, there's a little bit more work involved. I don't want to say there's a prestige, but there's generally a broader board of directors. There's a little bit more community involvement with the charity. And so as a result of that, you get a little bit more free publicity and status as a result of that. So we can all think of our local charities here in the Okanagan, and they're probably pretty predominant, and you may not be as aware as many of the not-for-profits in town as a result of that. And then as well, there's, yeah, absolutely, Sinead.
Yeah, just one point, Aidan, that I wanted to mention. I've worked with an NPO before and sat on the board, and sometimes we really struggled with being seen as a qualifying entity because we didn't have a registered charity status. And then we ended up having to jump through way more hoops to try and, get it received by somebody else. And then, as a flow through to us as the NPO. So there's definitely some time and kind of reporting obligations. Sometimes they're worth it and sometimes they're not. So that's really kind of up to the individual organizations to make that decision, to make those decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just the last point has to do with the taxation of GST and whether or not the goods and services you provide, they're automatically exempt from GST in that sense. Now, not-for-profits, there's situations where the goods and services you're providing may or may not be exempt from GST. And so GST is its own separate set of legislation that's established it. And if there's anything I've learned about GST is that just when you think you understand it, it throws you for a loop, and it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But so I won't get into details about that because I am not a GST specialist by any means. So obligation. So we've kind of talked about this, but again, you need to really devote your resources, and you got to devote all of your resources towards the charitable purpose. You need to maintain direction and control of the use of your resources. So quite often, what we see as public auditors is most charities require some level of assurance, whether that's an audit or a review engagement. Not all, but most do, because you need to be accountable for the resources that you're receiving and how you're dispersing those. You have the additional benefit of having to file the T3010, Registered Charity Information Return, and that again there's a lot more detail to that than with any of the other information returns. There is a disbursement quota that we'll get into. You do have to keep reliable and complete books and records. Must complete and accurate official donations receipts, which is, if I've seen anything, that's typically where charities fall afoul. And as well, you need to maintain your status as a Canadian legal entity. So there's lots of different things that you need to do in order to maintain that status. So disbursement quota. So one of the things with charities is you just can't keep accumulating assets and money and gifts and things like that. You do have to disperse it because that was the whole purpose. You're a charity because you have a designated purpose. And it does depend on how you're kind of structured. So if you're a charitable organization, you need to disperse 3.5% of your average value of property over 100,000. And if you're considered a foundation, then it's 3.5% of the average value of the property. A bit of a typo there, of 25,000. So it's not a lot, and so for many charities, it's not hard to maintain this disbursement quota, but it is a requirement. I think we've talked about this quite thoroughly. Along with the T3010, there is some other forms that may or may not have to be. The one that does have to be is the T1235, which is the list of directors. So if you're a director of a charity, you do have to disclose your address and whether or not you're arm's length with any of the other directors, as well as your contact information. So there's a little bit more personal information. It is protected, so on the Registered Charities site, that information isn't shared, but the CRA does get that information. And then as well, if you've made any, as a charity, if you've made donations onto other companies, you must complete the T1236 form as well and attach that as part of your submission. So there's some additional filing requirements, and your auditor or accountant can assist you with what that pertains to for your specific situation. So we've talked about the consequences of meeting obligations. I'm not going to go into detail because it was already really well covered, but you'll get education letters that come on board. You'll get compliance agreements, which really kind of provides a roadmap of what you need to do to get on the good side of CRA. Sanctions, this could be penalties or temporary suspensions of your status. And then worst comes to shove, you'll get revocation of your status, and that's the pretty serious situation. So as Sinead was kind of mentioning, back in 2015, 2016, the CRA performed audits of some charities. So they did both. They looked at charities and not-for-profits. As a result of what they looked at for the charities, there was 40 that had no change, 444 had education letters, 111 had compliance agreements. And then as you can see thereafter, the numbers get really small. So I think that's a really good sign. Only 59 actually had an annulment, and 4 had penalty/suspensions. I don't really know what the 25 other is, but so that's pretty good. That tells us that the charities that were surveyed or were audited by far are very well compliant with the CRA, with some minor things that needed to be improved upon, but considering the wide scope of charities that either have a full-time professional staff managing them versus a lot of volunteers potentially. You know, that's pretty good.
And as I mentioned, because that one, you know, 2015, 2016, that was kind of the last or most recent, I guess, full inspection, if you want to call it, that CRA had done. Johnathan touched on that a couple times in his presentation, that often the focus of CRA will be on taxable entities and making sure that individuals and corporations who should be paying tax are paying enough tax or are not evading tax or avoiding tax. So sometimes the responsibility of monitoring NPOs and registered charities doesn't fall as high on the radar. So it doesn't surprise me that the last one was in 2015, 2016. Also wouldn't surprise me if that their registered charities are maybe due for another one of these. So I think that one of the questions that came up, and I've been trying to address some of them as they come through, but somebody had a question about social enterprises. And it's a really interesting topic because a lot of I'll speak personally for a lot of registered charities that are clients of mine, often because of the pressures of fundraising and competition for fundraising dollars, because that's so prevalent within the NPO sector. NPOs and registered charities and executive directors will come up with ideas for what they can do to start social enterprises within their own organizations. One example that I can think of, and I'm sure they won't mind me sharing, is the John Howard Society here in Kelowna. A couple of years ago, they started doing one cup at a time. So that was a coffee shop that they had close to their premises that was really, for all intents and purposes, a social enterprise. Now, if that had kind of taken off and was, it fit the mandate for the John Howard Society, which really was to help train individuals in getting that kind of exposure back out to the public and getting some basic employment skills so that they could, you know, look for other employment elsewhere. But say if that had turned out to be something that was extremely profitable, the advice that we would have given, and we talked about it lots of times at the board level, was if this really starts to make profit, then you need to consider the option of spinning that off into a for-profit organization. And we've helped a couple of NPO clients with that spin-off, because the risk that CRA is going to do an audit and is going to find out that this is not incidental profit that you're making and it's not insignificant. You're actually running a profit-making organization within your registered charity, and that's a big no-no. So for, you know, the revocations and the penalties and suspensions, because you've worked probably very hard at getting your registered status as a registered charity, you're not going to want to call that into question. So that's where we've recommended for a couple of clients that you're actually, you know, making some really good money here. You don't want to risk it. Spin that off into a profit-making entity and just pay your tax on that individual kind of core spin-off rather than jeopardizing the organization as a whole. So that was, you know, one of the questions touch on social enterprise, which I know is a very interesting topic. But that's the end of our presentation for now. I'm just wondering, I'm just going to take a quick look. Dorothy, if you want to come back and moderate for us.
Yeah.
What would be the essential core organization structure and commitment level to support an application and to maintain status? I guess I still come back to it would depend on what you're hoping is the mandate for the organization overall. If this is something that's a sporting team or a recreational club, then, you know, going down the NPO route would likely be best for you. If you're thinking about setting up a registered charity that has, you know, local or provincial or national or international scope, then you're talking about a much different organization. The structure and the team that you would have to have in-house would need to be in place, as well as kind of what your expectations would be, you know, for a fully staffed board of directors, 5 to 15 members.
You cut out at the end there, Sinead. I don't know if it was just with me or was it? Sinead, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Dorothy.
Okay.
So I guess just kind of in summary, my response will be it depends on the type of scope of the organization that you're planning on creating. And if you're right at the inception stage, maybe now is a good time to kind of sit down with an accountant and a lawyer, because it depends on the scope of where you expect the organization to reach and kind of the size and go from there.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Sinead and Aidan, both of you too, for an amazing presentation and so much good information that we need to know. It's kind of, it's one of these scary and oh my gosh, and so good that I finally know this moments, you know. I just wanted to go over a couple of questions, and then somebody has raised their hands, and if it's okay with you, then I'll unmute her, and she can ask the question. But Mark asked, can you define incidental profits a bit more closely?
Yeah, incidental profit. I mean, if the organization is, you know, if it's like a hundredth of, you know, 10% of your whole organization is now in this incidental, that's not really incidental anymore. That could be construed as, you know, 10% of the volume of the revenues that you're generating are coming from this portion. That, I don't think that would be seen as an incidental. You know, there's no hard and fast rules as far as I'm aware from CRA, but I would consider maybe 1 or 2% of your total revenues could be deemed as incidental. Aidan, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I was going to say that part of that 2015, 2016 investigation audit that was looked at for both charities and not-for-profits, it was kind of a bit of a political quagmire, because at the time there was this perception at the federal level that these organizations were trying to circumvent the income tax rules, and as a result, there was a bit of a pushback, at the grassroots level, which I think was reasonable, because how do you define incidental? And the CRA, you know, that was one of the things, is like, well, how do you say that this one organization, like a lot of, like I know here in Vernon, there's the Upper Remission and there's CMHA Vernon. They have thrift shops and stuff like that, and they're generating bits of revenue just to kind of supplement the programs that they deliver, because as everyone that's probably listening on this call knows, it's very hard to generate revenues for your program delivery for what your purpose is, whether you're a not-for-profit or a charity. And so how do you say that that's incidental, or that's a for-profit activity? And so it just becomes, it's hard for even the CRA to try and quantify that. So I've yet to, in my experience, see an organization be told that they are taxable. You know, there's a lot more incentive now where there's actually social enterprises where they're fully taxable. Like I know in Kelowna, there's Current Taxi, like they're for profit, they're paying tax, but they're considered a social enterprise because of the way they are. They're coming up with a new innovative idea to kind of benefit society overall, and that's reducing carbon emissions. So that doesn't really answer your question, but I don't think we can really answer it, because even the CRA doesn't have a definition for it, unfortunately.
I can just wanted to bring up, because this was something that was an aha moment for me in an earlier session that we had with Jeffrey White, talking about social enterprise and the importance of the purpose of that social enterprise actually meshing with your mission as well. The CRA does not like it if you're doing a social enterprise that has nothing at all to do with the mission and a charitable work of your organization. And in your example, Sinead, with the 1 cup at a time, just opening a coffee shop doesn't work to have as a social enterprise, right? And as you mentioned, that it was the opportunity for training with the individuals, for an opportunity for the community to get engaged with individuals, that makes that charitable aspect, that makes it align more closely. Yeah, it makes it palatable, and it makes it align with it, right? So, because that was the thing for me, I had thought for a long time, well, if it's money that's just funneled into a charity, then it must be an okay enterprise for an organization, but CRA doesn't see it that way at all.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to just ask Anna to ask her question. Anna?
Hi, Sinead answered it. I was just required tax filings just as a society. But I do have another one. I was wondering, in the registration process, we're just a new society thinking about registering. Is there conversation back and forth? Let's say if you do put your application in with your activities that support your purposes, and if will CRA come back and say, no, you have to define them more, or they don't quite qualify? Is there that conversation, or is it just a rejection?
You know what, Johnathan and Aidan, if you wanted to kind of add on to anything that I have here, I will say, Anna, that, you know, CRA does get a little bit of a bad rap sometimes, but I do think that when it comes to registrations and applications like this, they do have staff that are kind of full-time in these departments, taking care of NPOs and taking care of the registrations. Advice that I would give for somebody who's in kind of where you're at right now, which is right at the start, and, you know, figuring out all of those pieces, is reach out to CRA and reach out to their department right now, and, you know, talk to somebody about kind of some best practices. They do have some good publications online, but I think the best, easiest part now would just be to reach out to them over the phone and, you know, find out who you're speaking to, and maybe some contact information if you have any follow-ups. But I think if you're invested in the process and are going to go through this registration, the earlier you can make contact with them, the better. That's what I would recommend.
Okay. Thank you, Sinead.
You're welcome, Anna.
Okay. I'll add to that too, Sinead, because I did at one point look at it, and a friend of mine gave me the advice of, you know, the CRA is in the business of collecting taxes, not preventing you from collecting taxes, right? And I was very scared to contact them, thinking, oh, this is immediately going to like cast a shadow on anything. But I was really pleasantly surprised at the support and the openness in being able, like a quick response when I called. It wasn't on the phone for hours waiting. And then just somebody who was very human and very kind, helping to answer some of the questions. And her advice at the time was that because they have they have different backlogs at different times, but she said the cleanest your application can go in, the best it is, so that they don't want to come back and ask you questions. They don't want to come back because that will delay the process, and you'll get caught in another queue kind of going into it. So really sort of giving it your best kick at the can the first time out with it. And as you said, getting information, getting advice before putting in that application.
Thank you. That's great feedback.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for asking, Anna. Does anybody else have any questions?
Dorothy, can I just, I typed, as Aidan was talking, I was typing a response to one, but it was a really great question about reserves.
Mm-hmm.
And is it okay to have reserves? And it's such a good question that comes up an awful lot. And, you know, the question that the individual raised was, is $200,000 too much to have in reserves? And, you know, guess what? It depends. But for the organization that you have, if you're operating, you know, a multi-million-dollar registered charity, then having $200,000 in reserves is not unreasonable, depending on your bylaws and depending on your accounting policies. Sorry, I had to get a plug in there. Some organizations find it prudent to keep a year's worth of expenses set aside in worst case scenario, you know, things that may or may not happen, like a global pandemic. So if your organization, if your operating expenses are $1 million, is it unreasonable to have that kind of buffer of 500,000 set aside as reserves? Now, on the flip side, if you're a registered charity that has $100,000 in revenue every year, keeping $200,000 in reserves with no specific purpose of what it's going to be for, that's going to be a red flag for CRA. An organization that that Dorothy and I know well was planning on purchasing a building after many, many years. And so their capital or their reserve fund set aside for that capital project was growing and growing and growing. But the aim of it was in order to buy out their own building. So that makes sense. That's reasonable in the eyes of CRA, as long as there's that tangible plan for what those reserves are going to be used for. If you're just accumulating just because that makes you as a board member or as an executive director feel more comfortable about the uncertainty of the future, that's not going to fly as easily. And that's what in the reviews of when your T3010s get filed with CRA, if those reserves seem excessive, that's the questions that they'll come back with from CRA, those reviews.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that, Sinead, is not only just the justification as to why the reserves, but how did you come to that number is important too, because I can think of a similar example where here in Vernon, there's a not-for-profit that has a couple $1 million in reserves that they've accumulated over time, and it's justifiable because they provide a support for government service, and there's a chance that they'll probably have to wind up operations if the contract isn't renewed or if the government decides to go another direction with that service delivery and how they're conducting that. And on top of that, there's other programs that they're looking to develop in the community to kind of further expand kind of other projects and things like that. So they have a very detailed analysis as to what it's for and how did they come to that number. So it's just not a dart in thin air, so to speak.
That's great. Does anybody else have any more questions? You could put up your hand or type a question in. Did we cover the benefits of being a charity well enough for everybody? That comes up quite a bit. One of the issues that people sometimes think, oh, I need to have charitable status in order to be able to write receipts for donations. And of course that's true, but an organization may not necessarily need to be able to write donations because businesses may want to sponsor. And so like if businesses are ones that are supporting you that way, then they would be able to write that off as a marketing expense as opposed to a charitable donation as well. So that's not necessarily always the only thing, but certainly for being able to access foundation money, being able to work that way, it makes it a lot easier. So lots of pros and cons for it. So hopefully you'll answer that. If Art has asked a question, I'll just get him to come here and share. Art.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I asked a question online earlier about the size of the organization and what is required. We're a very small, registered nonprofit in BC. Most of our members are more concerned with the activities than they are with the organization. So it comes back to what do we really need to make it sustainable if we were to go and follow through its CR registration. Excuse my voice, it's not working very well. Any thoughts on what would be a minimum in the way of commitment and the way of how many people would have to be involved, and also outside resources like BDO or KCR is to help us out.
Maybe just a couple of clarifying questions, Art. So you're a registered charity, or you're a non-for-profit?
We're a non-profit registered in BC.
Okay. And do you think that the goal of the organization right now is do you want to expand, or you want to, grow larger, or you want to get registered charity status?
Well, it's been suggested we should have registered charity status. It would help us with our funding to help with our programs and so on. Our main thing is to deal with social isolation in a particular part of the population, and it's done through activities. Those activities require facilities. Those facilities require funds.
Yeah, so I think it would depend a lot on, if you thought that you would gain access to more funding as a result of going to become a registered charity, then it might be more worthwhile. And maybe doing some research into, if we were a registered charity, would we be more likely to receive funds from whatever different provincial or federal program, and reaching out to those federal programs to see, well, would we qualify for this if we were a registered charity versus an NPO as we are right now? And if the answer is yes, we would take you, more seriously if you were this registered charity versus an NPO. Then it might be worth expanding on your board to bring in, put an accountant on your board, put a lawyer on your board, and other kind of individuals that would be experienced in the type of organization that you are. So you said your mandate is surrounding social isolation programs. Maybe having somebody with that experience on your board as well, to be able to kind of take it to the next level if you thought that you would be more eligible, or if you would get additional sources of funding as a result of that, Art. But I would want to make sure that that's the reason that you weren't getting the funding right now, and making sure that you would qualify if you went through kind of the hassle of becoming a registered charity, because there's a lot of kind of time and commitment and expense that goes into getting that status and maintaining it as well.
Okay, that's kind of the concern. I've had the feedback from several foundations and other funding organizations that, yeah, they could help us. They would like to help us, but we don't have the CRA number. Now, you've made a suggestion here that might possibly open some doors. Right now, our board is all dues paid members, and you're suggesting perhaps board members with special skills that are outside of the membership organization. Is that correct?
I would. You know what? I don't think even if you decided to not go and get your registered charity status, even if you just want to, progress the NPO, I don't think that there would be anything wrong with it expanding that kind of circle of expertise. I know that on the board that I'm on right now, we have some bankers, we have some lawyers, we have some accountants, but everybody has kind of their day jobs and then their commitment to what is the mandate of the NPO. So I think that there's no harm in getting like an outside perspective, and especially somebody that could donate in their free time, reviewing some of the applications, and looking through the CRA requirements of what that would look like. There's lots of kind of professional individuals out there that are looking for opportunities to kind of serve on boards, as long as the values align with what your NPO would be doing, Art.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I would just add one thing if I could, Art, is the other option as well. And so everything, like nothing I disagree with Sinead there. It's all on point. The one thing that you may want to consider though, is if there's already an existing charity in Kelowna, or I'm presuming you're in Kelowna, is that would want to take on your not-for-profit activity. So I know here in Verdon, there was a group of men had organized a not-for-profit. It wasn't incorporated or anything like that, and they it was called the Men's Shed, and it just was an opportunity for men of differing age to pass on information to other men and have a chance to socialize and stuff like that, and foster the facilitation of comradeship and knowledge. And they brought that whole idea and structure into CMHA Vernon, and CMHA Vernon is now running it. And those people, those original members that had kind of created the not-for-profit are still active in it, but they don't have to worry about the administrative aspect of it. And so there's also some benefits from kind of bringing your idea or your organization into the fold of a like-minded existing charity that may want to kind of look for something else to kind of expand their service delivery, and there's a lot of mutual benefits to doing something like that as well.
Okay, right on, because the organization I'm involved with is the Okanagan Men's Sheds here in Kelowna. Familiar with the
there you go.
Yeah, you're the first one. You're the first one. And other countries in the world have a men's shed organization as registered charities. There's over 1,000 in Australia, for example. They all come under our charity umbrella. And Canada hasn't got that yet. And whether we want to go that route, it's something we need to explore. But we're looking at our own situation here in Kelowna to see, is this something we can do, should do, and is it an advantage to us? So open to suggestions.
Great, thank you, Art. That was good conversation. Good points to it. It's funny, the Men's Shed connection with it. So just a question from Connie, please explain the difference between audit, review, and letter of engagement, and when you would need them.
I'll take this one, Aidan. This is our jam. Darn. This is what we do every day. So there's 3 options available to you. I'll summarize them really quickly. The first one is called a notice to reader engagement. The second one is a review engagement, and the third one is an audit. So very broadly speaking, I'll go into the costs at the very end. A notice to reader engagement is something that if you have a bookkeeper, an accountant that works for you in-house, whether that's 1 day a week or 1 day a month, they would prepare their own kind of internal bookkeeping. We take it, we put it on BDO letterhead, and we pretty much say on there, we're taking no reliance from this. We're making sure that it's factually correct and there's nothing, illegalities that are included in here, but we're largely taking your version and making sure that that it all adds, and so very, very low level work that we do, and rely a lot on what is prepared internally. The next option is a review engagement. So what we will do there is prepare a financial statement. We will have multiple discussions with management throughout the course of our work in ensuring that everything is plausible, and that all of the explanations that are provided are essentially corroborated throughout the engagement. It's not a full-blown audit, so it's definitely seen as somewhere in the middle. And the reason I presume that this the attendee is asking this is because there's different levels of requirement for funding purposes. And some organizations will mandate that you have to have an audit, and some will take a review engagement. So it's a less expensive option, but it just provides less assurance and less comfort, really. Now, an audit is what Aidan and I do every day, and that's a full-blown, going into your system, vouching invoices. You know, some people see it as a fairly painful experience. We don't find it painful at all. But really, it's a very reassuring process once it's over, that you have and are able to issue a clean audit opinion. So it's the highest level of assurance that we can provide. And typically for a lot of our clients, the only reason that they get it done is because they have to. And that's in order to qualify from either funding from Aboriginal Affairs, for CMHA, for CLBC, depending on who their provincial and federal government funder is. They'll require an audit often, but sometimes will accept a review engagement. Very rarely will an NPO or will a notice to reader engagement suffice. It wasn't asked, but I will say that the fee for a notice to reader can be anywhere between $1,500 and $4,000, depending on the type of organization that you have. Because you can have an NPO that's a very large scale. They just don't need anything more substantial than an NTR. A review engagement can be anywhere between, I would say, maybe 8 and maybe 20. And then an audit usually starts 10, 12, and that can there's no limit, depending on the type of organization that you have. But I would say for an NPO in Kelowna, in the Okanagan, anywhere between 12 and 20 would be the standard.
That's great, Sinead. Thank you very much. We have another raised hand, so I'll just go to Mignon here and she can answer.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi. Okay, I'm the one who asked the question about the social enterprise because our organization, which is a nonprofit charitable organization, went to a meeting, I believe last December, where the Community Foundation was responsible for looking for applications to encourage nonprofits to start thinking in a business model. And most of the people in that room were nonprofits, and they were assured that at the federal level that the CRA sat around the table with this organization, and they realized that nonprofits, many of them, like we're the Penticton Senior Center, we have our own building, we have expenses, you know, that the building's 20 years old, expenses are mounting, we get no support from the city at all, other than deferred taxes. So we need to raise money, and at this meeting, what they were saying was nonprofits need to start thinking in a business-like way, and they need to start putting aside money or raising money so they can afford those expenses. So my question is, you're telling me that we shouldn't be doing this, because we were successful in our application, not for the total amount, but we were successful in our application, which means you know, we are going to go forward and do an assessment of how we can use our building to generate more income so that we can afford the expenses that are looming ahead.
Yeah, so I guess the only comment that I would make there is, you know, CRA haven't come out the same as the kind of incidental profit question that came up a little bit earlier. They haven't said you can't make more than $10,000 in profit from this business that you're going to kind of do on the side, or else we'll deem you as a profit-making organization and you lose your charitable status. So they haven't set any kind of strict thresholds of what that is. So then it's largely open to interpretation. So what I would recommend is, if you're planning on doing that and you suspect that it could be deemed as a profitable arm of your organization, is make sure that you're documenting any kind of discussions and rationales about why it isn't, why this is really for your senior center's upkeep. And this isn't, you're not going out there with, okay, well, how can we make money today and how can we earn a profit? This is for the sustainability of the center. This is to keep the doors open and to keep the, you know, the roof in good shape. And I do think, like I said, even though CRA gets a bad rap, I think if you can prove that from the start, your mandate was supporting the continuity of the senior center, and not, oh, I wonder how we can make money from this different side venture. I think being prepared and preparing that documentation, should CRA come back and say, oh, something about this doesn't seem right, you can show them, you know, board meeting minutes, you can show them proposals for how you're expanding your mandate to include some of these activities, and kind of having a lot of that kind of in your back pocket, should the CRA ever do an audit on you and think, okay, well, maybe this could be construed as profit making.
Thank you. That makes me feel better.
Okay, good. Yeah, I think documentation is and showing them that you've done that research and that your focus now is on sustainability rather than profitability.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Mignon. Thanks for the question and clarifying. Thank you very much, Sinead and Aidan and Johnathan, for being here and sharing such good information with all of us. It's so good. This is the area that people always feel most nervous around, is sort of the law and the tax issue and CRA. So it's really wonderful of you to share your time and volunteer to be here. And so I'd just like to really acknowledge that we couldn't run these sessions without wonderful people like you stepping forward and doing that. And so thank you for that. But also we couldn't do it without wonderful organizations like the Law Foundation, who gave us the grant to be able to run this series. And hopefully we'll be able to continue to do that as well. I just wanted to say thank you also to the participants for being here and taking your time, for the commitment that you make to organizations in your daily lives, which is amazing. I wanted to just let you know as well that on Thursday, if you haven't heard already, we are doing our second nonprofit town hall with Norm Letnick, where we're featuring some panelists from the arts and culture, sports, and community sectors that will talk about how COVID has impacted their organization, how they've managed some of those challenges, how they've pivoted their organizations, and how they're continuing to deliver services during these difficult times. So that's going to be at 4 o'clock on Thursday. You can register for the session, and the information is all on our website. You could also watch it live on Facebook, where you can just listen then. But if you register with us, then you can have the potential of being able to ask those questions as well. And then the last thing is just on June 16th, Johnathan is going to be back, and he's going to talk about the Legal 101 nonprofit startups. And so for anybody that's in the beginning stages of their organization, this is a great session for you to join us. All of them are great, but that'll be a great one for you to participate. Was that tooting our own horn a little bit too much? Well, thank you again, everyone. Just to let you know, KCR Community Resources is really proud to be here for nonprofit organizations and to be a part of. Sorry, my phone is speaking. KCR is really proud to be here to support nonprofits, and aside from sessions like this, I'm always here at the end of the phone as well to be able to talk some things through or to help direct you to some other resources in the community if you're needing some help with that. So thank you to everyone for being here and for taking the time, and I hope you all have a good rest of the week.
Bye, everyone. Thanks, Dorothy.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.